Thank you very much, Deepak. First, a very warm welcome to Anne Oreford for joining us on this evening for her from Melbourne. A very warm welcome to the audience, and a special word of welcome to the students of History and Theory of International Law who find themselves in a room on our campus. So we're more numerous than it may seem from the people listed above your screen. It's a great honor for me to welcome Anne Oreford and to speak a few words of introduction about herself and the book she's going to speak about. Anne Oreford is Professor of International Law at Melbourne University, and over the last quarter century or so has become one of the leading voices in the history and theory of international law, speaking from Australia to the world and being heard by much of the world, I must say. She's a very prolific writer and editor. She's written no less than 3 monographs in the last 2 decades, 2 of which are now, I would say, classics already in their own right. Reading Humanitarian Intervention and International Authority and the Responsibility to Protect from some years later. But now last year in 2021, she published a new monograph, International Law and the Politics of History, which I immediately started to read when I received it. I think it was in August or early September on my train commute between Bruges, where I'm speaking from now, and Leuven, until I touched upon page 11 at the top of it, and where Anne Oreford wrote, and I quote, "If your professional commitment and goal is to produce scholarship that complies with historical protocols rather than to intervene in the present work of international law," and then I skip a bit, "then this book is not for or about you, and those historians can leave now with my blessing." I was a little bit tempted to follow the advice, although I'm not 100% sure whether I qualify. But as I'm always disinclined to do what people ask of me, then I continue and persevere to read the book, and I read it cover to cover, and I must say I'm very glad that I did so. The book is a very profound reflection, and may I say, and self-reflection by an international law on entanglements by lawyers and international lawyers with the past and with the writing of history. And I found it, as a legal historian, also very rewarding to read it, because it gives very deep insights in lawyers' entanglements with the history of their field, but also with the writings of people from other disciplines, including historians, and how they receive and perceive these writings. So I can strongly advise it to all historians, even of, let's say, the radical ilk, as described by Anne on page 11, to read it, as I'm sure people from all kinds of disciplines who intervene in the history of international law can gain a lot from this kind of very profound reflection and self-reflection about the history of international law from any discipline. And I think it's very useful to have these kinds of reflections for people from different disciplines, really to start a dialogue with one another about their approaches and entanglements with the history of international law. So without further ado, Anne, I give you the floor to present the argument of the book to the audience. Thank you.
Many thanks, Randall, for that very kind introduction. And thanks also to Deepak Marwah and the Institute for the History of International Law for the invitation to present this lecture. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, the traditional owners of the land on which I'm speaking, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I'm very grateful to have this chance to present my new book, International Law and the Politics of History. I'll start by offering a brief overview of the argument, and then I'm very much looking forward to hearing your responses to it. Before going any further, I'd like to just pause and note that the book has been read by some as a polemic or even as a manifesto. And there is indeed a strong argument that runs throughout the book. But the individual chapters also offer a detailed description and thinking through of the relations, roles, forms, and practices of international law, as well as a detailed engagement with the claims made by historians who work with international law. And I've tried to be as precise as possible about the claims I'm making and to give a careful account of the work of those with whom I'm in conversation, particularly if I disagree with their arguments. But inevitably, in this format, I'll convey more of the polemic than of that careful description. So the book's motivated by an encounter that has taken place between international law and history over the past decades. And most international lawyers would, I think, be familiar with the claim that international law has taken a turn to history, despite the fact that international lawyers have been engaged with the past for as long as they've been international lawyers. So the turn is taken to refer to a renewed engagement with history in international legal scholarship, beginning in the 1990s. And more broadly, the book is about the ways in which international lawyers look to other disciplines to ground our arguments about the nature, meaning, and effects of international law. Overall, while many stories about interdisciplinary work or about critical scholarship turn on accounts of marginalization or of failure, this book tells a story of success. So it's a story about what happens when a new approach to the study of a field begins to become central, dominant, and mainstream. So where initially innovation and pluralism were prized, as the new approach begins to be taken seriously, its proponents seek to appear more professional, rules of the game begin to be defined, risk-averse defensiveness kicks in, and innovation or non-conformity begins to be criticized as unscientific or political, or as we'll see, both. So the first part of the book, chapters 2 and 3, sketches the nature of this encounter between international law and history that motivated the book. Chapter 2 situates the turn to history and international law, and chapter 3 situates the turn to the international in history. So chapter 2 situates the turn in international law and argues that in order to understand what international lawyers were doing when we turn to history, it's necessary to pay attention to the arguments that were also being made contemporaneously in international legal practice. And I draw there on the work of Anneliese Riles, who argues that the legal academy is integrated first into the profession and only secondarily into the social science division of the modern university. So with that relation to practice in mind, I show in chapter 2 that the end of the Cold War marked a moment at which history began to play a more central role in international legal argumentation, both in theory, but also in practice. In the immediate aftermath of the Cold War, that turn to history occurred in the context of what was a newly unipolar world, in which international law was really being remade in the image of this sole remaining hegemonic power. And so both academic and practicing international lawyers turned to the past to assemble past texts, concepts, and practices into arguments that, depending on their point of view, were directed at rationalizing, at shaping, or at resisting this attempt to transform international law. In the subsequent decades, as this hegemony began to be unsettled, the focus on international law's history intensified, first in the context of the war on terror, then in the context of the interconnected financial, energy, climate, food, and humanitarian crises of the early 21st century, and then in the context of the disruptions to the international order posed by the rise of China, the resurgence of Russia, and the populist backlash against liberal multilateralism in Europe and the US. And history remained a key site of struggle over the nature, meaning, and legitimacy of international law in those contexts. So while some of the international lawyers whose work I discuss in chapter 2 understood themselves to be undertaking historical projects, many did not. And in general, I would say that the work being undertaken by international lawyers didn't conform to professional historical protocols, either in style or in method. And the aim was unashamedly and overtly presentist. So I take the time to make that point because historians of international law have tended to treat as interlocutors or as targets for critique a handful of lawyers whose published monographs specifically engage with historical themes or are written in a style that's designed to be intelligible beyond the field of law. But I argue that in order to understand what those lawyers were doing or what interventions they were making, it's necessary to have some understanding of, or at least curiosity about, the disciplinary conventions, the language games, the narratives, and the rules that shaped international legal arguments more broadly. And I'll come back in a moment to why I think that's important. So in chapter 3, I turn to the academy, and I argue that while the legal academy is integrated into the profession, it's also integrated into the modern university. So it has these two quite different audiences. So international legal scholars are also in conversation with debates in the humanities and social sciences. And our work is, of course, deeply influenced and enriched by that encounter. So that aspect of the situation of international lawyers informs the second version of the turn to history in international law, which is a turn to history as method. So in chapter 3, I explore how that was shaped in part by a corresponding turn that was taking place in history, and that is the turn to the international or the global amongst historians. And so initially it seemed very serendipitous that these two turns were taking place at the same time. So we saw international lawyers, legal historians, and historians more broadly developing a collective interest in the past of international law. And that offered not only a substantive overlap, but also often a common project, which I would characterize as complicating overly simplistic accounts of the inevitability of a newly triumphant liberal international law. But as the history of international law became more institutionalized and more contested, a growing number of historians began to challenge the accounts of the past offered by lawyers on methodological grounds. And over time, the term to history began to be understood as a project that should be distanced from the argumentative practice of international law, and instead its success measured against empiricist protocols of academic historians. So historians began to urge international lawyers to adopt a specific set of empiricist or contextualist historical techniques. And international lawyers were accused of misusing history to produce instrumentalist accounts of the past and called upon to adopt historical best practices or conform to the basic rules of historical methodology. So historians became increasingly critical of international legal scholarship. They described it as tainted by improper historiographic methods, dogged by debilitating anachronism and presentism, hampered by foreshortened versions of intellectualism, engaged in factional cultural politics rather than scholarship, and left behind in the 19th century. And I'm quoting from some of the more forceful critiques there. And so central to that argument was that there were a set of basic rules of historical methodology. And these included the prohibition against anachronism, that is, placing an object in the wrong time, a related call to contextualize legal texts and concepts. So that is, understanding the meaning of legal texts required situating them in a proper temporal context. a prohibition against presentism, meaning using the present as the lens through which to understand the past, and a concern with writing narratives about the past that moved between different periods or treated history on a grand scale. In addition, those approaches were presented as a means of upholding verifiability, distinguishing the abuses from the uses of history, resisting the political manipulation of the past, and taking a properly impartial or historical view of the past. So, as I discuss it in detail at various points throughout the book, each of those rules and those claims about empiricist historical method have been challenged within the discipline of history by other historians, as well as by art historians, by post-colonial theorists, by literary theorists, and by queer theorists. So numerous scholars have questioned the self-evidence of anachronism as an error, have challenged the assumption that the temporal context for a text or an artwork is narrow or unitary or self-evident, and have produced sophisticated reflections about the way that interdisciplinary work across law and history can unsettle the methodological certainties of both fields. And indeed, while lawyers were being berated for not conforming to empiricist historical protocols, a number of historians were in fact writing influential manifestos expressing concern about this demand for conformity with specific empiricist conventions within the field of history. And I'm thinking of Joe Gouldy and David Armitage's The History Manifesto, and Ethan Kleinberg, Joan Wallach-Scott, and Gary Walder's Theses on Theory and History. But the key point to note is that little, if any, of that scholarship registered in debates about historiography and international law. So it wasn't the methods of critical or heterodox scholars that were introduced as historical standards or best practices. And in turn, numerous international lawyers proved very receptive to the idea that empiricist historical methods offered a set of technical rules to which legal scholars should conform. So chapter 3 shows that this exchange proved unproductive. The structure of the debate produced a very static account of both law and history, reducing any sense of the complex positions and approaches available in either discipline. And it had two broader effects that seemed problematic. First, historians of international law engaged primarily with scholars who were part of the Third World Approaches to International Law, or TWAIL movement, or with scholars who worked on related questions related to international law and empire. And I think historians were able to engage with that work because it was written to be accessible and legible, and to communicate the complexities of legal debates to a broader audience. But historians of international law largely didn't acknowledge, let alone engage with, the work of most scholars and practitioners who are part of the contemporary international law field and whose work engaged with the past in numerous ways. So the effect of that narrowed focus meant that historians of international law mounted energetic critiques of TWAIL scholars or other international lawyers whose work engages with histories of empire, but the scholarship and arguments of mainstream international lawyers were unchallenged. But as I argue in the book, much of what TWAIL and other critical international law scholars were criticized for doing, such as using analogies or choosing relevant precedents from a massive past cases, or considering the evaluative meaning of a concept rather than treating it as determined by a given temporal context, or assembling different events and texts into a coherent narrative, is the work of law, the mainstream work of international lawyers. But there were no heated articles arguing that, say, Daniel Bethlehem or Harold Coe or Christopher Greenwood were betraying historical protocols by reasoning via analogies or using precedents or assembling arguments out of past materials and so on. So one reason I wanted to broaden the debate was that if Twale scholars or critical scholars were being told their methods were flawed because they failed to conform to historical protocols, it made sense to ventilate this claim properly. Otherwise, the effect would be to confine the argumentative choices available to one group and leaving the mainstream playing the game as usual. But in addition, as I wrote the book, it was becoming increasingly clear that a consensus was emerging around the question of what counts as proper methods for undertaking legal work with a historical consciousness. And it seemed to me that this would get in the way of having the kind of debate about the relation of international law to social, political, and economic transformation that I think is vital and timely. And indeed, for many of the early career scholars with whom I was working, this was the effect. Complying with empiricist and contextualist protocols was becoming the measure of scholarly rigor for historical work. So in the second part of the book, I stand back from the debate and examine more broadly how it was structured and with what consequences. And I argue that in order to make sense of that encounter between international law and history, we need to consider a much longer narrative about the relations between law and history. So in chapters 4 and 5, I invite readers both to recognize and then step outside that familiar narrative. So much of the scholarly work admonishing lawyers for ignoring or questioning historical methodology simply asserted the timelessness of those rules without explaining why that was desirable in a normative sense. So in the fourth chapter, I set out to explore what lay behind the sense that legal argument poses dangers of political manipulation and that humanist historicizing offers a liberatory method. And I explore there how bringing history into relation with law has enabled a form of boundary shaping that co-constitutes an idealized or demonized sense of both fields. And I'm focused particularly there on the work of a group of historians of political thought who've been referred to since the 1970s as the Cambridge School. As I explain in the book, I focused on scholars associated with the Cambridge School for a number of reasons. First, their approach has been a touchstone for many participants in the debate over the correct methods for studying the past in international law. And many of the historians who have engaged with the turn to history in international law have been influenced by or associated with the Cambridge School. But second, and perhaps more importantly, the manifestos, the methodological manifestos associated with the Cambridge School have provided the clearest, most compelling, most influential, and at times most polemical accounts of why the extension of particular kinds of empiricist historical methods should be applied to past ideas, texts, or even thought. So the strongest account I can find of why and how empiricist historical methods should be extended to the field of law or related fields like theology or philosophy emerges from contextualist intellectual history. And so I discuss that field in some detail. But as I show throughout the book, the same empiricist assumptions underpin the work of those who understand themselves to be doing a history of legal practice or a disciplinary history. So when I explored the methodological manifestos developed by influential historians associated with the Cambridge School, I began to notice a striking feature of their manifestos. In a close study of decades of work produced by Herbert Butterfield, G.G.A. Pocock, Quentin Skinner, and Ian Hunter, I showed that the debates which the turn to history and international law generated have been shaped by a very powerful story about the liberating force of empiricist historiography. And in those narratives, humanist historians are presented as progressive disruptors of legal orthodoxy. So it turns out that lawyers are everywhere in the work of contextualist historians, both in their manifestos about method and in the narratives they produce using those methods. So the figure of the lawyer as a scholastic apologist for power or as a moralizing judge reappears throughout the texts of those historians. And in addition, their narratives stage the lawyer as a foil against which a second figure is opposed. And that second figure who arrives on the scene to challenge the oppressive authority of received tradition is the humanizing historian. So the take-home point is that this longer narrative helps to make sense of the certainty with which empiricist historians have presented their role as radical disruptors of legal orthodoxy and their methods as at once impartial and scientific, but also revolutionary. So in chapter 5, I explore what that story misses. So I invite us to step outside that story to an extent and think about the way that contemporary international lawyers in fact work with the past in the practice of legal argumentation. So in other words, this chapter questions two arguments or claims that are made about contextualist or empiricist history. First, that it can offer interpretations of past legal texts or practices that are impartial and that are not informed by the struggle for the meaning of law in the present. And second, that contextualist methods or empiricist methods can have a liberating effect on existing claims to legal authority because they show us that law is a human creation rather than the embodiment of universal values or inherited traditions. So I argue that humanist historicizing is not above the struggle for law and can't have these effects because its arguments have been incorporated as a central part of international jurisprudence and argument for at least a century. So for at least a century, historicizing challenges to scholastic metaphysics and to formalist reasoning have been embedded within the existing field of international law. So in that sense, I argue in the book that we are all realists now, and critiques of metaphysical or ahistorical thinking have been fully incorporated into our patterns of legal argument. So that doesn't mean that metaphysical thinking or transcendental claims have disappeared from the law, but rather it means that the claim to be able to reveal the metaphysical or enchanted thinking of an opponent is just one more tool in our toolbox. And so I offer in that chapter then a very detailed description of how this has been embedded both in the theory of international law and the practice of international law over the past century. And I show that it's impossible to seek to correct uses of the past by this historicizing technique without becoming part of the legal battle. So my argument in offering that detailed description and my motivation is not aimed to defend international law, but rather my premise is that whether you want to defend international law, use international law, challenge international law, or destroy international law, you first need to understand the situation of international law today. Historicization does not automatically undermine the foundations or challenge the operation of international law, although it will do so in some circumstances. So finally, chapters 6 and 7, the last chapters of the book, suggest why this encounter matters. And in short, I suggest that the turn to history and international law today has begun to work as a new foundation for formalism. So historians of international law are presented and present themselves as offering impartial verifiable accounts of international law and of the history of international law in a hyperpartisan field in which partisan accounts are all that anybody else has to offer. But in chapter 6, I argue that those historical accounts are necessarily as partisan and political as those produced by the most pragmatic of lawyers. And that is because any study that is presented as a history of international law involves writing a history of something for which there is no stable referent or fixed object. There is no uncontested, impartial, or verifiable answer to the question, what is the history of international law a history of? Because there is no uncontested, impartial, or verifiable answer to the question of what is international law. So presenting a history of something called international law involves generalizing and abstracting. In writing histories of international law, historians have to decide which practices and texts out of the mass of archival material available from past eras is relevant to the history of international law and why. The author of such a history gives form, shape, direction, scope, content, character, and meaning to something called international law by choosing how to narrate the history of that object. And those choices are normative or political rather than technical. Any work that settles on international law as an object will accept and consolidate one out of a range of contested presentist accounts of what international law is. And I argue and show in that chapter that the more successful a historian is at presenting a plausible account of the history of an object that they call international law or international human rights law or international economic law, the more they become part of the legal field and the international law game. And in that chapter, I give some examples of this. And I argue that the effect is that historians of international law or international human rights law or international economic law become participants in the struggle over what international law is and does in the world. And I think that's okay. So to be clear, I don't see being part of the struggle for international law as a criticism, and none of that would matter so long as historians didn't present their accounts as somehow empirical correctives to the normative and partisan myth-making of international lawyers. And so long as their readers didn't believe that the claim that their historical scholarship is empirical and impartial. But historians do make those claims, and perhaps more importantly, international lawyers echo those claims. So in the final chapter, I argue that the interplay between international law and history has served to offer a new grounding for formalism in a very fraught political context in which international law and adjudication plays a central role in justifying the distribution of material resources on a shared planet. Historical arguments are increasingly being used to guarantee the truth of legal interpretations or legal arguments in a post-realist field. So in a symposium about the book that's soon to come out in the Temple Journal of International Law, there's been some pushback on this sense that the international law field is post-realist. So let me explain why I say that. I characterize the international law field as post-realist because what counts as a persuasive legal argument in international law has been deeply influenced over at least the past century by the realist challenge to the idea that law is a system of rules, the meaning of which is determinate, and the consequences of which in any individual case can be mechanically and apolitically derived from those rules. So in the early 20th century, Scandinavian legal realists challenged metaphysical elements of legal thinking, and American legal realists challenged formalist modes of legal reasoning that were being deployed to legitimize the role of judges and adjudicators in the context of the New Deal, where conservative US judges were nullifying progressive legislation in the name of protecting property, liberty, and freedom of contract. And the forensic dissection of formalism and metaphysics by the legal realists reshaped the nature of persuasive legal argument. So in claiming that the field is post-realist, I don't mean to suggest that all international lawyers overtly and enthusiastically embrace the insights of legal realism. Clearly, that's not the case. But rather, when I claim that the field is post-realist, I mean it in the sense that we talk about post-colonialism or postmodernism. So temporally speaking, the current pattern of argument and authority in the field of international law exists in the aftermath of realism, indeed in the aftermath of waves of realism. So it's not news to anyone that some lawyers claim that international law is a social product rather than a set of rules handed down from time immemorial, or that legal texts or legal practices are open to conflicting interpretations, or that judges make choices between competing and contradictory rules or precedents in reaching decisions, and so on. So what makes the field post-realist is that we're all then left to reckon with the potential anxiety that such claims produce. And my argument is that the appeal to history currently offers one way of addressing the unresolved conflicts produced by the widespread acceptance of realist premises on the one hand, and the need to justify the expanded role played by international adjudication on the other. So my argument is that the turn to history has become a turn to a particular tone or style of writing about law, a turn to history as method, which is strongly neo-formalist. Formalist arguments about what a text really means, or what an international institution is really designed to achieve, or what international law is really for, can be smuggled back into legal argument in the guise of empirical history. To speak in the language of history about international law is to speak with a tone of certainty that is otherwise largely unavailable to lawyers. So my argument is that despite its appeal, we should resist the turn to history as neo-formalism. Lawyers can't look to historians, or anyone else for that matter, to escape the anxieties produced by legal realism and looking to another field to offer us impartial and verifiable evidence-based interpretations of what international law really is, means, or stands for. As the realists argued, law, and I would add its histories, are made rather than found. Creative legal work involves creating plausible patterns, analogies, or narratives by assembling past material from disparate sources in ways that are persuasive to legal audiences. So that's not to say that studying historical material is worthless. And indeed, a particular historical method, including contextualist historiography, may be extremely useful in particular contexts, but get in the way of a clear analysis or a persuasive argument in others. So the question then is, which partisan and political vision of the history of international law best helps us to grasp the current moment, and why? And in the end, no other discipline or method can lift us above the political battle for the law or offer us an escape from uncertainty. All that's available is to construct an argument and commit to the premises or values underpinning it. And I conclude by suggesting that we need to take responsibility for the choices involved and to recognize that doing so is an ongoing and an evolving process. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anne, for this Well, impressive summary in half an hour of the argument in your book. I think also looking at Deepak, we have about 20 minutes for questions and answers. So I immediately open the floor and invite anybody who wants to intervene by raising their virtual hand. I'm looking at Dave or Villa. Is there also a possibility for the students to raise questions from the room? Dave, is that possible or?
I'm not sure. Maybe I'll ask a question to Villa.
Or Villa?
Hi, everyone. Thank you for everything so far. I'm on family childcare duty today, so I had to cancel my presence in the room. So I'm not sure if the students are in the room. Instead, I've shared the link with my students, so there should be them around. But
okay, well, that covers that.
Yeah.
So who wants to raise a question? Willem, maybe now that you have the floor.
All right. Well, thank you, Anne, for this summary of your book. I have more of a reaction, if I may. I don't want to take too long in here, but I just want to thank you for this book. I found it answering questions that I hadn't really paid so much attention to. I have a bit of a past in doing comparative law before I ended up in the history of international law and international law more generally. And over there, long story short, I understood over time that I was in a field that was thoroughly stuck in a tug of war between a split in identities, a professionalist identity and an academic identity. And that scholarly field did not have such even this kind of an idea of its substance as we as international lawyers do. I completely agree with you that international law is always open to definition. It's not a fixed thing, but nevertheless, from looking at from that side of the fence, it felt like international law had a substance on a completely different level that's defined for international law. And within this discipline, I didn't look into those methodological I didn't encounter similar methodological tugs of war to the extent as these comparative lawyers had. I understood that as a Bourdieusian identity or habitus issue linked to Hans Kelsen's idea of a purity of law. So this very typical continental class legal law faculty hierarchy of jurists of a specific field and kind being at the top, and then these sort of soft people around and that sort of thing. And this was, of course, the tug of war that they had. And here within the field of international law and among historians of international law, it took me a while to understand that there was something similar going on. And when I first encountered these debates, I was wondering, why are we really going into these methodological questions? Because for me, they meant that they were always linked into our scholarly identities, and there was this threat of sort of getting stuck there. But what I feel is that your book actually gave me the vocabulary and structure to sort of bring out into the open these tendencies and to engage them. And what I really appreciate there is that you present to me an understandable image of how the historians sort of come into the picture and what their critique of the simplistic lawyer judge who's being sort of very simplistic about history and this humanist contribution of the historians. I really appreciated that, and also for the fact that you reminded me of basically the other side of the international lawyer's view about how we can look back and remind the field that actually, if we're discussing the history of international law, then we are inescapably bound with the theoretical questions about the nature and substance of the law that we as lawyers always encounter. So I really felt like you gave us an image of this potential tension and a vocabulary to deal it with. And the reason why I find it so particularly welcome is that I see this as very intensely linked with scholarly identity, and therefore there's like a potential for all kinds of collisions that might not be necessary. So that's just my reaction to the book. I'm afraid I can't translate that into any kind of a question, but since I was given the floor, I hope that that somehow contributes to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Ville. Anna, do you want to react?
Thank you, Ville. Well, I feel very grateful to hear that it seemed to offer a vocabulary and a structure that allowed a movement beyond an identity kind of response. And it's interesting to refer back to this Temple Symposium. So there were, I think, 15 contributors to it, 4 of whom were historians, 4 were international lawyers, but some of whom were kind of working across law and history. And certainly for that group, there was a sense, I think, of identity being part of the story. And so my aim wasn't to kind of firm up disciplinary boundaries, but in a sense to reflect upon how this debate allowed, or in a sense, co-constituted the 2 disciplines in ways that wouldn't have been possible if the 2 disciplines weren't being brought into relation. So in effect, it was creating a kind of stronger sense of of what international law is and what history is than would have been possible in the absence of that encounter. I think that's a point that numerous other people have made in the context of interdisciplinary engagement. So we kind of see that argument made by Sheila Jasanoff in relation to encounters between law and science, for instance, and a number of commentators have made such arguments in relation to engagements with economics. So there's, one unexpected consequence, I think, of interdisciplinary encounters can be, in a sense, to firm up the disciplines rather than to kind of create more permeability between them.
Thank you. I see we have a question in the chat by Anujit Tiwari. I'll read it out. Absolute pleasure to hear you. I would like to have the speaker's opinion on international law history. Is history written from the perspective of European academia? Well, historically, it has been claimed that Eastern or Asian histories are, if not older, just as old and rich in international law. For example, those of South India rulers like the Chola Empire. Does this change the perspective? Does this change in perspective also change the methodology of recording the history of international law? It's a very broad question.
Yes, great question. Thank you. So I have a couple of answers to that. One would be that absolutely the argument that there is no objective answer to what the history of international law is a history of, because we don't have an impartial answer of what international law is. And that would absolutely apply to the question of whether we assume that the European tradition of international law is the only tradition of international law or a privileged tradition of international law. There have been powerful arguments made that we only begin to treat European international law as a universal system of international law at a particular moment of European colonial power. And I think we are again beginning to see that idea of international law equating to European law coming under pressure with, as I said, these shifting geopolitical currents that we see today. So the book spends a lot of time talking about the way, for instance, in which Chinese international lawyers and philosophers have been producing narratives about the history of international law from a perspective that centers China in that story. And there are, I think, many other ways in which we could take that position and think about the way in which our histories shore up a particular vision of what international law is now.
Okay, thank you. Who wants the floor? Who wants this opportunity to raise a question? While I see no hands, I'll abuse my position as chair to make a small comment. You can react, of course, to that, and then I have a very broad question then. One of the things that struck me most, I may even say to some extent surprised me in the book, was your claim, although you persuaded me of the truth of it, but I didn't see it coming, was your claim that the turn to contextualism or contextualist claims may lead to neo-formalist claims about international law. My comment would be that I'm sometimes worried by kind of an opposite movement happening from the historical side, where okay, we speak about the turn to history among international lawyers, and David Armitage, I think, launched the term to the international, or the turn to the global now, among historians. But what always, I must say, struck me most in the historical field is the fact that historians, like historians of diplomacy or cultural historians or economic historians, over the last, a bit later than the 90s, I would say, in that context of the turn of international, have just turned to law, because for many historians, law was always, let's say, the unknown field or the field they shied away from. One of the consequences, it seems, in some historical arguments that are made is that, let's say, the forms of law become very fluid. And of course, we have terms like multinormativity, the fluidity between what is law and norms, to the point that there might be an almost breakdown of any, let's say, definition of law in the historical field, and that law or international law sometimes seems to dissipate within a general social historical argument, which then concerns me to the extent that that kind of history writing then becomes very unrecognizable to any lawyer. So that's a comment. My very broad question would be, what should we do now? You sketch a narrative of 3 decades of engagement between law and international law and history. And of course, in those 30 years, the interest in the history of international law has grown massively for many fields, not in the least from history. And now we find ourselves on this very rich and well ploughed field of the history of international law, where we have farmers from many sides coming in. I think you wrote a wonderful book that gave me an enormous new insight in how international lawyers feel and think about this. But my very broad question would be, what should be the next step? What should we do? What should we, in that broad field, try to attempt, or what should we attempt actually to not fall in this kind of pitfalls like neo-formalism from one side, or a kind of dissipation of the form of law from the other side?
Okay, great. So just to comment on first on your comment, Randall, which is, I very much agree about the sense that there's a kind of diffusion of law, or a very yes, very relaxed, I'm not quite sure the word I'm looking for, but nonchalant approach to what law is taken to be once global historians start to develop what I think they think is a pluralist account of law, but which seems to float free of anything. So I talk about that to a degree in chapter 6, where I look at examples of what it is that historians are looking for when they look for the history of international law, or international economic law, or international human rights law, particularly if they explicitly disavow the need to look for what was called international law, or international human rights law, or international economic law at any given time. So then the choices become very much choices that need to be defended. So why is this practice being treated as law, or why is this precursor being treated as the origins of international law or human rights or whatever? And I do think very often, though, the architecture that supports that kind of history is in fact something that's been written in the present that they're working off without really being explicit or overt about what those choices are. So I think, for example, this is why I would argue for a need for more responsibility and clarity about how these choices are being made, what it is that's being looked for in the past as a kind of marker of international law. But as for what should be the next step for the field, maybe that would take us back to the page 11 that you opened with, and what it is that the ambition is. So for someone who, and I'm not being, it sounds a little facetious, but I wasn't being facetious there. For someone whose ambition is to produce a more detailed description of the past of international law in some professional manner, I suppose there's nothing I could offer as to what should be the next step. The next step would be driven by some other set of priorities. But for my work, or the work of people who I'm engaging with, then the question remains, what work needs to be done? What do we need to understand and engage with in the present in order to participate in the transformations that international law is undergoing and needs to undergo to kind of deal with the challenges of our time? So that would be very much driven, looking to the past overtly for presentist reasons. And that would then, I think we would all have different answers to that question. My work at the moment is, for instance, I've begun doing a lot of work on climate change. I've just been teaching a course on that at Harvard. I'm very engaged in thinking about that, including through turning to the past. And of course, there's an enormously powerful body of historical work that engages with what climate change means for how we think about history. So in my own work, that's one of the things I'm doing. But I think it would be very much driven by, I think it should be driven by, for international lawyers, presentist concerns, when of course, engaging with the past will help inform how we think about the future. I've also, in the Temple, in my response to Temple, set out some protocols for interdisciplinary engagement, because I've decided that I won't mandate a new set of rules or methods, but I am happy to offer some protocols for the encounter. So that's one of the ways that I tried to respond in the Temple Symposium.
Okay, I'll look forward to that. I see we have two questions in the chat. You can read them, and length maybe to read out.
Okay, so the first question is by Ryan Yi, and it picks up the part of the book on the rise of China and the end of the revolution in chapter 2. So the question asks, engages with my interpretation of China's attitude towards international law, the coexistence of realism and idealism, and the use of history in that story, and asks me whether I think that China's neutral attitude and commitment to the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence is shifting in light of its response to Russia's action against Ukraine, given China's opposition to the use of force and interference in other countries' internal affairs. And also given that Mao and other early leaders consistently opposed the expansion of the Soviet Union. So, great question. Again, I can't answer it really fully, I think, here. But suffice to say that one of the really important things I wanted to do in the book was to include China in the story and to think about the quite different narrative of history that is informing the way in which Chinese lawyers and leaders understand and present the role of China in the world today. I think I absolutely agree with you that one of the stakes of what's happening at the moment in Ukraine involves what it will mean for China and China's relationship to Russia. And I'm watching, as everyone else is, with great interest to see how this is going to play out. My sense is that we're going to see Russia become more entangled with China, but I think less as, I think more as a kind of tributary state, or so very much within the kind of China's sphere. So I think we're going to see Russia kind of enormously weakened by what it's doing in Ukraine. But I think that China will not, here's a, my sense is China's not going to take a strong position against what Russia's doing. I think it will maintain this kind of abstaining from critique, and that in the end we'll see a kind of closer alignment of China and Russia. But that is a very amateurish reading of what's happening there.
Then there's another question by Anuji.
And so, do I agree with the point that international law history has become more of a source as an evidence of customary international law rather than being a source of facts? I'm not quite sure how to answer that question. I would say that both of those, that the past plays a role both as a source of facts and as a source of practice that we look to in order to make arguments about custom. So in the book, I try to explore how both of those aspects of the use of the past are part of legal argumentation, and how it's impossible to engage with the way in which international lawyers use the past, either as a source of facts upon which decisions are based, or as a source of the material out of which we weave customary international law. That it's not possible to intervene in that use of the past in a corrective way. So that to the extent that historians have claimed they can offer us impartial accounts of practice or impartial verifiable facts, I try to show in the book how those claims rub up against what it is that international lawyers actually do with the past. And my argument is that it's not possible to engage in the way that legal argument uses past facts or past practices without being caught up in presentist debates over the meaning of international law. So you ask how readers can separate the grain from the chaff. I guess I would say that work of separating the grain from the chaff is political and normative, and it's part of the work that international lawyers do.
I'm seeing we have 2:06. I'm looking at Deepak and whether we still have time and at the end, or whether we should round off.
We've got plenty of time. It's really up to, I thought, kind of depending upon questions or how many more questions Anne's happy to take. So we can go on that basis.
Okay, there's a question about suggestions for literature. Before I give the floor to Anne on that one, I would draw the audience attention to our site, historyofinternationnal.org, where you can find a basic reading list with a section that answers this question, but maybe Anne can have some additional suggestions. You will find several articles there by Anne Oreford, by the way. But there's also another question by Luis Peraza on the future of democracy in China. Takes us a bit further from the book, but Anne, you're happy to reply.
Well, my sense is that's not what we are seeing in the immediate future. So I'm not a scholar of China, I should be clear, but I think there are very interesting debates. So the question is, will we see a democratic China in the near future? I would say that there are extremely interesting debates in legal and political theory by Chinese scholars, to the extent they're being translated into English, that explore the question of representation. So less so the language of democracy, but more so the language of representation. I think there's a sense of a crisis of representation worldwide, including in China. And I think that literature is extremely interesting. So what it will mean in terms of a move to democracy in the near future, there don't seem to be any clear signs of that, do there? But this question of representation, I think, is one that there might be kind of more movement there, and questions around the Communist Party and the crisis of representation, also in relation to the Communist Party, are being posed by Chinese academics. And that is a very rich debate, and some of it I touch upon in the book.
Oh, Randall, you're muted.
I muted myself, sorry.
Yeah.
Are there any further questions? You can also, of course, raise your hand or take the floor when you have the use of a mic. No, I don't see. Oh, yes, Philip.
Hi, so if there is room, I thought I might try to take the floor again. So I'd like to thank you for all the support for the TWAIL and critical scholars within this book and around it. Like in our courses here in Tilburg, we basically studied plenty of Tony Angie, and that's like the starting point, and Self and Marte Koskaniemi. Could I just ask you, how do you feel it's going for them and this, the Cambridge School historians? Are there new developments? How do you feel about it? I understand that, okay, there's going to be a symposium coming up, and that's probably where we'll find some of these answers. But I thought, if you've got thoughts about how things are developing these days. It's been a few years of conversation already, I suppose.
I'm not sure I quite know what you mean, Ville. So how they're developing in what way?
Well, I mean, I remember that you pointed out that some of the critique has been leaning based on the Cambridge School scholars, and so I suppose in general, I thought how this has been received by people. If I understand this is probably going to come up with the symposium, but what kinds of reactions you may have received from people who have been engaging in this conversation on the historians side. And my reference to the 12 was just mostly based on the fact that I remember reading that very often this critique about presentism and anachronism was directed towards 12 scholars, and that's why I started from that angle. But I just thought, like, what kinds of reactions perhaps there have been so far. Thanks.
Okay, great. Well, so there was a symposium on the book that was organized by Lucas Lisinski that was published on the Brazilian blog International Law Agendas. So that was a great discussion by four Brazilian international lawyers taking up the arguments made in the book. So three very enthusiastically, and then Jorge Galindo was the fourth, and he is much more of a enthusiast for contextual history. So he was, I think, more critical of the book in that respect. So I replied to that symposium explaining my position on the contextualist school, and in part, you know, making the argument that I don't want to and don't argue that contextualism is a bad thing. So my argument is not that contextualism is irrelevant or that it's misconceived. Rather, the argument I make in the book is just that contextualism is not an impartial method for understanding meaning that exists above the political struggle, and it's not always useful or radical. So deciding when and why to deploy contextualist methods is a political and normative question, not a technical one. But otherwise, you know, I don't see myself as an enemy of the Cambridge School. So I think sometimes the argument is taken to be a dismissal of contextualism, but it isn't. And obviously I kind of make contextualist arguments myself in different places throughout the book. So it's rather to see that to reconstruct a context is to be doing normative and political work, not technical work. Just as to reconstruct a tradition is to be doing normative and technical work. There are two different ways to understand how we should situate a text. Should we situate it in a context or should we situate it in a tradition? And both of them require work to establish either the context or the tradition. In terms of TWEL, I had a great discussion of the book at IDLP at Harvard, and a kind of very interesting discussion around the TWEL and post-colonial aspects of it. Arnulf Becker-Lorca has a kind of response. He's been writing about the book, so I don't know if he will end up publishing it, but it was extremely interesting in relation to those questions. And I've had some kind of very positive responses to the book from early career scholars. And in a sense, it was really written for early career scholars. So I think that's really made me I'm very kind of delighted by that. It's probably the response that's kind of been the most rewarding.
Thank you. There's still some questions. One about representation. Whether you have any key texts to advise. Then a follow-up question by Luis Peraza on China too.
So I'm happy to, if Ariel, please, you could write to me and we can have a discussion about possible sources there. Wang Hui is the person I was reading in particular that I was thinking about. I can't, so I think I've exhausted my capacity to be helpful on the ins and outs of democracy in China. Yeah, so I don't think I can offer any more answers to that. Many thanks for those questions, though. I think they're important. But perhaps your next speaker could be an expert on Chinese legal history and offer some more responses to those very good questions.
Indeed, be a good suggestion to the organizer. Are there any final questions? I would give a last chance now. I'll take this as a no. Then I would like to thank Anne again for having this talk with us this evening for you. It's quite late now, past 10, if my calculations are correct. Thanks for doing that after having traveled from the United States so recently. Thanks for writing the book, and I would advise everybody to read it who's interested in the history of international law. It's a marvelous intellectual journey through 25 years of history writing on international law from the perspective of a very perceptive international lawyer and a very engaged international lawyer. And I would all want to invite you to the next I-HILT lecture Deepak is going to say more about. But again, Anne, and let's give her a round of applause in any possible way in this somewhat unnatural, still unnatural setting.
Thank you very much, Randall, and thank you everyone for coming along.